Good afternoon, everybody. Courtesy of Oxford University Press, we don't have any copies apart from the one desk copy. But as Remco said, there are flyers, so you can get a discount. So I'm really here partly because I wanted to try to use this event to begin to launch this book, which is pretty much hot off the press. And so this book, if I can figure out, there we go. So this is the cover of the book, and what it does is it actually tries to capture about the last 20 years or so of work that I've been doing in the globalization and health policy space. Now, I didn't start off life being a globalization health researcher, much less actually even being an academic. The first 15 to 20 years of my life, I spent as a public health promotion worker. How many of you kind of have done some work around health education, health promotion? No, a few of you. Okay, so kindred spirits. And what happened then is kind of a, going back to the early 70s, and as a kind of when I first got my first working in public health, about 1973, this was a time when the dominant message was very much about individual lifestyles, which was a kind of a bit overwhelming for me to sort of consider this, all of these individual health behaviors. Count them, only 192 bad habits to change to be able to live healthily forever and forever. But having kind of grown up from the late 60s and through the early 70s, through all the progressive social movements from the left, the feminists, the environment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I wasn't terribly happy with what that particular message was about, especially when you consider that one of the messages from the early 1980s in Health Canada, no bad foods, only bad eating habits. And I went, well, wait a minute, what is it that creates these bad eating habits? What is the kind of industrial base and the economic base that sort of creates or promotes all of these unhealthy behaviors, all 192 of them that we're supposed to change? So I kind of thought about it a bit more and decided that, well, in fact, I have to write something about that. So in the late 70s, I wrote this monograph, Health Promotion Philosophy from Victim Blaming to Social Responsibility, and I essentially challenged there as best as I could in my naive, angry young man way, that we really had to deal with these politicized health actions based on looking at class and poverty, gender, indigenous, native rights, and environmental stuff. I was card number 42 of this little funny environmental group that formed out of Vancouver. Some of you may know it as Greenpeace. So it's become much more than just a funny little backroom group out of Vancouver. Occupational health, empowerment, the whole issues around social justice. Now, this was before we had the wonderful empowering rhetoric of the Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion. And at the time, I was employed as a health educator, health promoter, working for a very conservative right-wing provincial government back in Canada. So they thanked me very much for having to promote this or create this little monograph, and then they fired me. My suggestion is that if you take anything away from this particular talk, is that if you're serious about some of the issues related to justice, related to sustainability, etc., and you want to take that as much as you can in the work that you do, you're going to face political risks. Now, nobody wants to get fired, especially now that we're living in the age of precarity. But if you need to take those political risks, my suggestion is you do them very early in your career. So anyway, I kind of kept working away. The things that got me fired in one part of Canada made me this hot commodity in another part of Canada that was very progressive it was the city of Toronto during the late 70s and into the 1980s. And so they hired me to say, okay, we believe you. We believe all this equity stuff. We believe all this political stuff. How do we do it? So I had a kind of carte blanche for a number of years to try to play around with ideas about empowerment, community development, healthy public policy, political advocacy, working with various social action groups in different ways, mostly at kind of a local level, maybe going up to the provincial or federal level in Canada from time to time. And I used this to kind of generate a whole bunch of different models. And I was always liked writing, and so I wrote a lot about this. And this stuff kind of got me invited to start doing training programs and running educational programs and doing research in different countries based upon some of these ideas that I'd helped to generate. And then one day, it was in the early 1990s, I realized I was going from country to country to country. And place after place after place, the health workers, the health ministry people, the university people I was engaging with were all complaining about the same thing. Constant reorganization, retrenchment, declines in resources or in services, privatization. And so I thought, well, if this is happening in all these different countries that I'm going to and it's the same story, was there something happening at a global scale that was affecting the ability of national governments and subnational governments or local places to actually put in place and work upon the sorts of wonderful empowerment kind of initiatives that drove so much of good public health practice? And that was in 1993. In 1994, we know it. In 1995, we knew what happened, the creation of the World Trade Organization. So that's what got me involved in this idea of globalization. I was concerned about what was happening at this kind of global scale of market integration and how it was affecting governments at differing cascading levels in terms of their ability to act in ways that promoted health equity in a socially just, environmentally sustainable fashion. So hence the book. Now I'm going to run through a few topics in here. I already gave you the preface, because in the preface I talk a little bit about how I got to write the book in the first place. Why am I doing globalization, Mr. Empowerment? It's a long book, and it does consolidate all kinds of research, ranging from trade and health studies to migration studies to health worker mobility and patient medical tourism studies, gender studies, critiques of neoliberalism, labor market policy. So it runs through a whole gamut of all these different pathways that affect, via globalization processes, affect health outcomes. What I'm primarily going to focus on is the final chapter, because there what I tried to distill in that final chapter what I consider to be the three great crises, the three existential crises that are confronting us right now. Describe what they are, kind of how bad they are, but then what kind of policy alternatives exist, what kinds of things we can do to turn those things around. First point, of course, is what do we mean by globalization? What's globalization? Just anyone want to blurt out a single word, a phrase?
You could say it's the interconnectedness we have, because such as in the EU, you have a border-free zones, and throughout the world you have easier and faster transportation.
Yes, interconnectedness. Anyone else?
The creation of global markets.
Global markets. And in fact, you find that globalization is a term really only, although you can trace its first use back maybe to the 1950s. As a term, it never really became popular until the 1980s and into the 1990s, when all of a sudden it took off as a concept. And it primarily referred to economic market integration. So that's been one of the driving forces. But there are other aspects of globalization. So kind of at its simplest, we know that it's these multiple processes. That's why I wanted to title the book Health Equity in the Globalizing Era, and not title it Globalization. Because globalization is too static. It's like we've arrived at some place. We're not. We're in a continuous state of arriving. And there are multiple processes and changes that are very dynamic and alter from year to year. So all of these different processes that have to be interrogated. So we have nations, businesses, people, more connected, more interdependent. So we know that there are changes in how we conceive of ourselves. most of you, I suspect, were not alive when Neil Armstrong touched on the moon the first time. But there was something very dramatic about that image of Earth from the moon that really altered, warped, fundamentally changed for those people who were watching it at the time and subsequently what our perception is of ourselves. So we have cognitive changes, we have temporal changes in terms of everything so fast, so immediate, so instantaneous. That's always been a part of human history, but now it's just really on steroids. We have a change in our notion of geographic place. So there are multiple different ways in which our understanding of ourselves and our place in the world has been affected by some of these globalization processes. Is it something that's new? No, I see a head. You know, it's not new. So why is it not new? How is it not new? Oh, you were just shaking.
I cannot explain.
Oh, you cannot explain. Okay, well, anyone else want to try? New? Not new? How many say it's new? How many say it's not new? Oh, okay, you're all right, it's not new. No. Basically, I mean, you could say that globalization, in the sense of this idea of multiple processes of connecting across space and changing our concept of ourselves in time, is as old as human civilizations. Civilization in this sense being when people developed a surplus and were able to begin to aggregate and structure into societies. What has changed is the notion of what constitutes the totality. So once upon a time, we had a flat Earth, and if you went too far, you fell off the edge of it. We had various little empires that would sort of try to creep across each, borders and accumulate a little bit more, then get pushed back. Various types of exchanges. But now, if we look at how the maps have changed over time, we have a differing sense. The Peterson scale on the lower right-hand side there, which actually reflects now a little bit more accurately the size of the African continent. So our sense of what constitutes a border is changing. And although we still have a kind of almost a oppositional, dialectical set of forces at the present time between trying to protect and re-erect our national borders at a time when our own consciousness about what constitutes who we are transcends those particular borders. So globalization and health. Good for health? Bad for health? And the answer here is, again, this qualified yes, but. So we've had this phenomenon of the child health revolution. And that's been very low technology, primarily driven by some innovations that came out of high-income countries first. Oral rehydration therapy, promotion of breastfeeding, immunization, those sorts of initiatives. So we've seen this massive decline. But we still have a lot of babies, a lot of young infants in the world dying needlessly. Drops in maternal mortality, quite a lot, but not enough. Improvements in life expectancy, yes. On an average, we're all living longer, and even some of the people who didn't live quite so long in different parts of the world are living a little bit longer now. But that life expectancy is hugely still unequally distributed. And we do have improved gender rights. I guess the question partly comes up is to what extent is globalization responsible for these things? To what extent is it creating impediments to their achievement? So as I said, I'm going to draw primarily from this last chapter. And there we see a nice little comment that it's globalization, what in the third world has several centuries called colonization. And as we've had warnings from many of the United Nations and other multilateral agencies, this notion that too many people have experienced too few rewards from this process called globalization. So I said, I'm going to talk about 3 existential crises. And I'm going to give you the spoiler alert, which is probably for about the next 40 minutes. If I'm successful, you'll be near suicidal. So we'll talk about all of the problems, Because in understanding the problems, we get to understand why they arose, and that will allow us to talk about what the solutions are to those particular problems. So we'll focus first on rising inequalities. And part of the globalization story has been, hey, we've eliminated or almost eliminated or hugely reduced extreme poverty. And to an extent, this is true. So that little blue line on the slide here at the very bottom, that is the World Bank poverty level at below $1.25 a day in consumption. It's now since been adjusted to $1.90, so the better, more appropriate poverty level is the one that's red. But you've seen there's been a pretty steady decline, and kind of still a decline in most of these things, with a little slight raise on the people that are above $10 a day. But it calls into question how adequate these World Bank measures of poverty actually are, when you consider that the absolute poverty level changes by the income level of the country under consideration. So if you're a low-income country, you're absolutely poor if you have less than $1.90 a day in consumption. If you're a high-income country, you're absolutely poor if you have less than $21.70 a day in consumption. So this is somewhat adjusted. But even those folks, those researchers who have tried to make these adjustments are absolutely adamant that even if you're at the high-income country level, the upper middle-income country, the lower middle-income country level, you're still poor. It's still kind of a deplorable living existence that you have at these levels. And we know as well that it's been fairly unequally distributed. If you take China out of the equation in terms of measuring global poverty, you find there's really been no difference at all in poverty levels at these $1-a-day increments. And in Africa, in absolute numbers, you see there are more people who are living in poverty in Africa today than in 1990, when we set this target to eliminate extreme poverty. So we've done well, but considering the extent to which our global economy has mushroomed in size over this period of time, we could have done tons and tons better. So, you're all familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, right? Who's not? And all of you can rattle off all 17 of these? Oh, we haven't even talked about the 169 targets yet, have we? So, we have the poverty goal, right? And that's to eliminate extreme poverty at this $1.90 a day level by 2030. By 2030, 400 million people will wake up and still be extremely poor, given the current projections around how well that we're doing. And in fact, now they've officially readjusted the target to sort of say, well, if we hit just 6% being extremely poor, we'll have achieved the target. But is it the right target? Is it a good target? The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, working with research backwards on the basis that it's reasonable to have a life expectancy of 70 years. Now, I don't know about you, but I would actually find that very unreasonable because I'm getting very close to that, and I'd like to live a bit longer past that 70 years. So it's a pretty modest ethical kind of life expectancy bar to put in place. But based upon an average life expectancy of 70 years, UNCTAD estimates that people would need at least $5 a day to be considered not poor and to achieve that average life expectancy. And by that metric, in 2030, 90% of South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa would still wake up January the 1st, 2031, and they'd be poor. That's since been revised to $7.40 a day. And if you work on that basis, 4.2 billion people will wake up on January the 1st, 2031, and they'll still be poor. And some estimate that they actually really need to be living at least at $10 a day to be considered not poor. What this really speaks to is that all of our rhetoric around achieving poverty reduction has really been primarily that. It's been rhetoric. That what we're trying to achieve, that our bar for achievement, for success, is so low that it's almost irrelevant to many people's lives. How many of you have come across this before, the Preston Curve? Yeah, so a few of you have. So this basically plots life expectancy at birth by the GDP per capita by country. And so these are estimates from, I can't remember quite what year this was, but it was 2005. So you can sort of see that there are countries that, as they grow a little bit in GDP per capita, they start to improve. Their health starts to improve. Their life expectancy starts to improve. And technically, it continues to improve even when you get to the far right hand of this particular graph. But there's a kink. There's a kink in this. And that kink is here, which basically means once you pass this level of GDP per capita, your gains in life expectancy by more economic activity flatten out. You don't get a whole lot more health bang for your buck. And that line basically happens at around somewhere between the $5 and the $7.40 a day in consumption per person. What it basically means is that we can have a huge amount of better health if we are finding a way of simply moving some of that per capita from the right-hand side over to the left-hand side and flatten that up, raise it up to the top. Now, the assumption here is that our conventional economic model, economic growth, should be able to do that. I mean, that's what you hear from many development economists. You hear it from a lot of politicians, a lot of the talk, if you happen to go to the Davos Rich People's Club meeting on an annual basis, a little bit of skiing on the side. But a colleague of mine kind of looked at this and started saying, well, under the ways in which poverty is being reduced with our current economic growth models, yes, we could eliminate that. So we could actually eliminate extreme poverty at that level. It would just take us 100 years. And to do it at $5 a day, well, 200 years. But if we wanted to do it the $7.40 a day, maybe about 300 years. And this, of course, ignores the fact that what happens if you're spending 300 years of continuous economic growth in the environmental commons. So many of you are probably familiar with Oxfam's campaign, the Even It Up campaign. And so what Oxfam, when they first started out that campaign, they said, well, the 85 richest people have the same amount of income or wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion people. And isn't that disgusting, right? Isn't that awful? Except that they made a mistake. Because billionaires are a very tetchy lot. And they don't like it when you underestimate how wealthy they actually are. So using other data sources, the Forbes report, they basically said, well, it's actually not 85, it's really only 67. And then in 2016, when Oxfam redid the numbers, they said, oh, it's only 62. And at that particular period of time, since 2010, going into 2016, when Oxfam did that number, globally, you saw this distribution where the income of the top 62 increased by 42%, and the income of the bottom 3.5 billion decreased by 41%. Now, there's not a direct correlation here, but you can basically sort of see this shift upwards that's been spiraling like crazy over the last 30 years. And so the most recent one in 2018, 42 people. One way of graphing this over time, and some of you may have sort of seen this particular model, Branko Milanovic, formerly of the World Bank, although he's in and out of the World Bank in terms of his place of employment, tried to look at an individual level, how have we seen income growth change over time? And sort of said from between 1980 and 2016, you see this kind of hump happening down here at the lower part. And that's really kind of the emerging economies, so that we saw that there was a greater proportion of income growth happening in that part of the world. Meanwhile, you saw this dip occurring. And that's really kind of the industrialized working classes of the high-income countries being squeezed, the so-called middle class being squeezed out. And then you saw this huge amount going up to the top. So this has sometimes been referred to as the elephant curve, as it looks a bit like an elephant. But this is maybe a simpler way of showing the same curve without the little explanations, like that. But this is relative income growth. Does anyone want to tell me why relative income growth is not the best way to understand what is happening in the global economy over time? Anyone? Okay, who wants to be someone, put their hands up, and you earn $100 a year? Who wants to be that person? Just put your hand up, just so I can point to you. Anyone? Okay, okay. You earn $100 a year. I earn $1 million a year. Okay? Yeah, over that. Yeah, exactly. So what happens is that 10%, your income rises 10%. And you now make $110 a year. Mine only goes up 5%. But now I'm making $1,050,000 a year. So relatively, I am $45,000 a year richer than you are now. So the problem with relative scales is they don't tell you what is absolutely going on. And it's the absolute numbers that are most compelling, because people don't live relative lives. They live absolute lives. So when you reconfigure this in absolute dollar terms, you get an entirely different picture, where most of the world, until you reach the 99.9, so we're getting to the 0.1%, not just the 1%, but the 0.1%, it's been fairly flat. And then it just skyrockets. So this is the equity problem that we're faced, point blank. And that means why it's at least important that this particular goal in the SDGs is still there, the reducing inequality within and among countries. Now, during the time when the SDGs were being negotiated, this was not the most popular goal with some of the wealthier countries involved in the discussions, and you could probably understand why that would be the case. The problem with this particular goal, it's good to have there as a headline, but the problem with this goal is the target is to disproportionately lift the income growth in the bottom 40%, so that the bottom 40% of the world's population would grow at a faster rate than the top 60%. But as a little illustration turned out, unless you are redistributing from the top 60% or from that very top part to the bottom 40%, you're going to still have these huge chasms of difference in income. And income is important insofar as the political power that that income provides you with. And that political power then structures all of the national and global governance systems, which determine, in a large measure, whether people are going to be able to lead reasonably healthy lives. There is, as well, the gender dimension. This was quite compelling when I came across this. I hadn't really occurred to me that, in fact, over this same period of time from 2006 to the present year, that the income gap between men and women is not getting smaller. You know, that was a bit of a stunner. I sort of thought that it was beginning to close, but it's not. It's actually sort of becoming larger. And that when we take a look at the high-income countries on female-to-male pay ratios, they're still pretty striking, the differences. Same jobs, same qualifications, same skills. The X chromosome, double X chromosome versus the XY chromosome, that's about the only real difference. Okay, that's the first of our three existential crises. So moving on to the second of our existential crises, and this is one that I think probably all of us are aware of, and all of us are living it each and every day. And that is the problem of ecological collapse. Now, one of the interesting things here, and this is when the Lancet Commission on Planetary Health reached its conclusion, is this paradox, which is that around the world, at an aggregate level, we're healthier now than we've ever been in recorded human history. But we have all of these concerns about our environment. And what the planetary health folks sort of said is that, well, the contradiction we're living is that our healthy and healthier lives today are essentially extracted from our future because of the resources that we're using to achieve those healthier lives today without paying any attention to what it actually is going to mean for health possibilities in the future. And those health possibilities aren't looking too terribly good. So this is one of the kind of scientific, the environmental scientists, a publication a few years ago where they tried to look at the different systems in the planet that are essential to sustaining life. And what we find is that there's at least 2 of them where we've already crossed any kind of a possible safe threshold and we're in the danger zone. Genetic diversity or biodiversity, and the phosphorus-nitrogen cycle, which is really about kind of what allows things to grow in the earth. So it's our agricultural, environmental, water cycle. Many of these we don't actually have information on, so novel entities. That's all about the artificial, tens of thousands of artificial chemical structures that we've made since the 1940s. We don't have any real knowledge about the long-term impacts of those are. And a simpler way of looking at how we're broaching all of these boundaries is this rather scary chart. And it's the second time this group of concerned scientists, 15,364 of them from 184 countries, publicly have gone on record screaming and shouting about the state of our ecological commons. Now, so freshwater resources down, marine catch up, dead zones up, forests down, vertebrate species way, way down, emissions way up, temperature change way up. But the 2 that I find probably the most dramatic are in the upper left and the lower right. In the upper left, it basically tells us, we did it once with ozone. Now, admittedly, that was a much easier kind of thing to do. It wasn't kind of challenging fundamentally the entire economic system or power structures. But we were able to basically get rid of ozone with the Montreal Protocol. All the countries agreed. And then zoop, down the chlorofluorocarbon emissions, and the ozone emissions went down. The other problem we face is population. And that's the issue that refuses to go away, and the one that still remains extremely contentious to talk about. But in 1960, right, 3 billion people on the planet. Now we're rapidly approaching 8 billion, and we'll soon probably hit 9 billion. And I think some of the forecasts is that the population is not going to actually diminish until we're closer to around 15 billion. Question is, can our ecological commons satisfy the needs of that many people? Then we have the issue of pollution. And that pollution, mostly in terms of air particulates, air pollution, something that for many of you who are, if you've been in global health, we know the big 3, right? HIV, tuberculosis, malaria. Maybe we're now getting a bit concerned about some of the other more neglected tropical diseases. But pollution is killing far more people, each year now. 3 times as many people as the big 3. And most of it is not in the high-income countries that have generated most of the background air pollution, but in low and middle-income countries. And fossil fuel is the main culprit involved. And this pollution, the cost of this pollution each year is estimated by that really radical group called the World Bank at more than $5 trillion per year is what the economy loses as a result of this pollution. And the big five publicly traded oil and gas companies each year spend over $200 million lobbying governments and using social media to try to prevent any form of climate change mitigation or any kind of fossil fuel use reduction. So that's kind of what we're up against. But the good news is that you could actually make an economic argument where eliminating all of this stuff actually saves the economy money. We have a similar problem with water shortages. 2.7 billion people, again, mostly in low and middle income countries, suffer from severe water shortages. And the UN report basically is estimating that by 2050, over 5 billion people will not have adequate access to sufficient amounts of water. Now, can you imagine what is going to be in a planet where 5 billion people can't get the water they need to survive? Right? Can you sort of see what the kind of collapses that are likely to occur? And a bit like in terms of greenhouse gas, we have the equity dimension where the big emitters, the big sources of the problem, the countries in the red, are ironically the ones who are facing the least problems. Another way of graphing this, the kind of the Gapminder project, the bloated countries there are the ones that are most responsible for, they're the cumulative emitters. They're the ones who are producing the most pollution, the most carbon dioxide. But the bottom one shows the aggregate mortality rates for 4 climate change-related causes, so malaria, diarrhea, malnutrition, and inland flooding. So we're getting a sense of the huge global skewedness that here's the countries that have created all the problems, and here's the countries that are suffering all the consequences of the problem. If this doesn't get you really depressed or make you really mad, I mean, at least don't get depressed, get mad. And then we have this problem called consumption. Our entire economy is predicated on production and consumption, both domestically and globally. And so the big fear we have now amongst conventional economists, amongst countries, is how, given an aging population, how do we sort of keep people continuing to consume, given that they have less and less disposable income because of the shifts in terms of how economics have happened and who's got all the money and who's got all the wealth? Well, the answer to that, of course, is your credit card. So we have probably about the most indebted planet that we've ever had. But we've been kind of predicated this model that we need to continue consume to keep our economy going. And as soon as we stop consuming, the economy goes into recession and then into depression. We have a fundamental contradiction here. Because if we keep the economy going, we're basically going to wind up with no water, a planet that is inherently unlivable. But we have this huge push to be able to consume. So I love this one about Uncle Sam. I want you to buy stuff. Then we have all of these kind of retail gimmicks. Black Friday. Do you have the Black Friday events here in the Netherlands? Right. So everybody lines up. Oh my God. You know, like for hours and hours so that we can get 50% off and buy more stuff that we don't need. And then, of course, we have this. How many of you change your phones about every year? Every 2 years. Oh, you wouldn't admit that now anyway. Well, every 2 years. Oh, someone was brave enough to admit, yeah, every couple of years. I mean, the amount, our technology here in terms of our cell phone, our televisions and so forth, they're run using kind of precious kind of metals that are driving the wars in the DRC in Congo. Okay, so worse than the pursuit of gold or of blood diamonds. And each cell phone, smartphone that we have, and the quantity of these expands 5 to 7-fold with each passing year. And each one, every gram of smartphone requires 650 grams of fossil fuels to make. So each gram of a smartphone, 650 grams of fossil fuels, and 10 times that amount in water, that weight in water. And then this stuff used to wind up in China. China said, no, we don't want to take that much anymore, kind of, after having taken it and killing themselves with the pollution, running it off. So it winds up in certain parts of India or South Asia, certain parts of Africa, as e-waste, which is highly, highly toxic. Now, put it kind of rather bluntly, we don't need that technology, right? That technology is not on an annual basis. We're consuming it, but do we really need it? What is it giving us except more ways for advertisers to basically get us to buy more stuff because I want you to buy more stuff, and to keep this kind of inherently toxic and pathological consumption economy rolling on and on and on. The other one, of course, is fashion waste. We are producing far more clothing than we ever possibly use. How many of you, when you go home into your closets, right, kind of you look in your closet and you wonder, how did I manage to get so much stuff? What am I going to do with it all? How many of you give clothing away? Yeah. And you know what happens to that clothing? It gets bundled up, given to charity. Charity can't sell it all, so they bundle it up and they sell it to entrepreneurs who bundle it all up and they ship it off to Africa, where it enters without any kind of tariffs, and because there's no cost of production involved anymore, because thanks to you, you've already paid the cost of production. It's very cheap. It goes in and it becomes this market item. It's probably reasonably better quality than the stuff that's produced locally, but it puts out of business any of the local textile mills, and then people become unemployed as a result, and they go into the informal economy. And this has happened in sub-Saharan African country after country. The one I know best is Zambia, because I've done work in Zambia. So the thing here is that too much clothes, right? The fashion waste. So that kind of, you should be pretty depressed about how horrible things are. I'm getting to the good part about how we change it all. But I got one more to go. One more to go. Migration. So what do we do about this migration problem within and across borders? One of my favorite sociologists is the late Zygmunt Bauman. And in a book written back in 1998, he basically argued that the world was becoming divided into two classes: tourists and vagabonds. And I found that imagery very evocative, very powerful, because it kind of speaks to, the tourist class here and then the vagabonds here. So we have a massive amount of people on the move, right? 66 million international migrants who are considered each year to be forced, right? Not each year, but in total forced. They're moving because they need to. 258 million international, 763 million internal, because people move internally for some of the same reasons that drive them to move externally. And we know that most of the refugee or migrant camps do not exist in high-income countries. They don't encroach on the borders of the Netherlands. They're mostly in the neighboring states of the poor countries from which these people are moving. No kind of, real question about whether the people in the boat here, are they the tourists or are they the vagabonds? And there's a wonderful poem that was written by a Kenyan-born Somali poet who's now living in London. And she expresses it that no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. No one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. So we need to dismiss, and I was at a conference on migration earlier, or around this time last year, up in Edinburgh. And one of the points that we were debating there is this notion of economic migrants, that we have this class of people called economic migrants. And I said, we just have to dismiss that, because people are striving and struggling to get by. So whether they're doing that for economic reasons or they're doing that because environmental pollution and desertification and climate change is pushing them out, or because of conflict is pushing them out, people don't move unless they feel it's absolutely necessary and essential for them to move. Now, the response we know is that, we have this issue of, let's put up walls. You know, it's really simple. Let's just build some more walls, more borders, this kind of stuff. It's a bit like we think that just like feudal Europe, we can somehow sort of wall or gate our castle, and then we just draw up the drawbridge like that, and we'll be safe. Well, over 65 countries are now, in some way or another, erecting border walls to keep other people out of their country. A bit like globalization, though, this is not a new phenomenon, so we have the instance, of course, of China, which built the Great Wall for similar purposes to keep out kind of the Mongols that they didn't really want to come in. But what we're left with now are tens of millions of people who are housed in massive refugee camps. And these have been euphemistically described as cities of tomorrow. That these are camps that are going to be around for decades. Some of them have actually organized as cities, creating their own little economic infrastructure, much the way that people in some of the larger cities in South Asia or in Africa, in what used to be called the slums or the informal settlements, or across Latin America, create formalized settlements as a consequence. But it's a pretty scary picture in terms of the way in which we've got massive incarceration happening at a global scale. Again, this is a new phenomenon. It's why migration or people on the move, driven environmentally, driven economically, has become like the third major defining kind of moment that we're confronting. But lest we think that we still don't have kind of the tourist class around. Now recall that picture of the boat with everybody looking up, the Vagabonds across the Mediterranean. This boat on the upper right-hand side is a favorite of one of the Russian oligarchs that is 500 feet long and also sails around the Mediterranean. It's quite possible now, and countries increasingly are offering citizenship for sale. So Cyprus is one of the major kind of favorites now of the Russian oligarchs, and so much so that one of the former Greek villages, all the signs are now in Cyrillic. So we're seeing the wealthy being able to buy their way into the places that otherwise erect huge borders and security measures to prevent the vagabonds from even considering entering. Now, in terms of looking at the international skilled health worker migration, this is just a little bit of an aside, and it's really to do with the fact that one of the studies that I was involved with a few years ago was looking at the migration of skilled health workers from lower middle income countries to high income countries. So from countries that had an undersupply of health workers to countries that, comparatively speaking, had an oversupply but a perceived undersupply, and we'd have this movement of skilled health workers. Now, these skilled health workers were often trained, if either directly at public expense or partially through public subsidies in these low and middle income countries. So we just calculated that in Canada, looking at the South African physicians who'd migrated since 1993, that we saved $700 million in medical training costs in our public universities. And South Africa spent $70 million training them that they lost when the physicians left their country. So we have this problem of, and it's not just for physicians or for nurses, but all skilled health workers. When you have skilled labor force leaving a country, it basically hollows out and prevents any kind of domestic economic development in that country. An interesting point, though, that was raised by a guy named Michael Clements at the Center for Global Development in Washington, and he basically sort of said that the response that we often make to this is that, well, we just give more development assistance. Well, no, that's not really going to happen. The evidence actually suggests here that as countries become a little bit more economically developed, it creates a hump. So there's migration. Migration starts to pick up when there's a little bit of growth, and then as that growth happens, disappears. And the reason for this is that for somebody to leave a country, they need to have resources. If you're absolutely poor, it's going to be virtually impossible for you to try to migrate to another country. So you have to be at least in some bit of an economic pocket, which is why many of the workers who do successfully migrate, not as refugees or as asylum seekers, but as migrants, actually have pretty high educational levels. And that becomes a passport for being able to move. And are having to move because of their own fears, their own security, environmental issues, political issues, conflict issues. But as the country develops a bit further, migration drops off because people no longer kind of feel that they're living in the mouth of a shark, as that Somali Kenyan poet put it. Then finally we have, in terms of the migration issue, this kind of interesting idea of the demographic pyramids. So the argument here is that in high-income countries, we've got this squishing kind of effect where we have very few people who are actually in the supposed economically productive cohort age of 15 to about 60. So as that age group gets older and older and older, there's fewer people supposedly in that consumption production economy who are producing to be able to create the economic stuff that would actually support or subsidize people in their old age. And yet in low-income countries, you have the inverse kind of demographic pyramid, a huge population under the age of 20. So those who argue that really what we ought to be doing is having open borders so we can move more of those people into the countries that have the shape on the left in order to increase the base of the working age population. What's wrong with that picture? Why won't it work? Apart from the politics and borders and people and all the reasons why we have this kind of backlash around migration, well, it won't work because it becomes a perpetual, endless cycle. Because you move everybody from one country with a huge amount of younger people into a country that has a huge amount of old people, and pretty soon that population's going to start to get old itself. Then what do? You add more to the base. That's nothing more than a recipe for endless incremental population growth. Because the model, but it's premised on the fact that we have an economic model that says this is what we have to do. We need to keep having people productive in that economy at that certain age. If you're getting the impression that I'm basically talking about the inherent contradictions in an economic model, you're right. I am talking about the inherent contradictions in an economic model. In fact, projections show that by 2060, the kind of like really weird shaped high-income country pyramid on the upper left-hand side is going to be the same one globally. So we're not going to be able to solve our economic problems, our equity problems, our environmental problems, or even our migration problems simply by that policy of saying is that we have more and more people coming in and we'll grow the base at the middle. We need a more radical type of solution. So, our three great crises. How do we understand them? How do we proceed? And I want to do that by kind of very briefly just touching on this concept of neoliberalism. Is that a term most of you are familiar with? Okay. It's bandied around a lot, but I want to put in the context of Friedrich von Hayek, who was really the one who first theorized neoliberalism, taking classical liberalism but putting it kind of on a much more defined, more individualistic trajectory. So free markets, sovereign individuals, free trade, strong property rights, minimal government. Best recipe for enhancing human well-being. And Hayek also argued that the economy is too complicated for governments to bother to figure out. And actually, he might be a bit right on that one, but it's probably too complicated for anybody to figure out. So this is the belief about free markets, sovereign individuals, free trade, etc. And a couple of economists at the time when von Hayek was first promoting this particular model, Keynesians, friends of John Maynard Keynes, expressed this belief somewhat differently. that the nastiest of men for the nastiest of motives will somehow work for the benefit of all. So Keynes had a different kind of a model which emphasized much more redistribution, stronger labor rights, more government management of the economy. And what happened, of course, is that predominated in the 30 or 40 golden years after the Second World War. So Keynesian economics, and despite the fact that neoliberalism was there as a theory at that time, it never found a real place to kind of grab onto and to dominate. And so Keynesianism was the flavor of the day up until the 1980s. And what happened in the 1980s, and we see the rise of a kind of a neoliberal model, was the developing world debt crisis. So after we had these oil price kind of explosions that occurred, and the developing countries had to pay more and more money to be able to import any of the oil because of the cartel and the quadrupling in the oil prices. And the petrodollars and the first world banks were sort of funneled off into these countries in order at these loans. Then we had this monetarist policy that jacked up rates and sort of, it basically created a condition in which many countries were experiencing the potential of sovereign debt. And Mexico was the first to basically warn that it was going to collapse and go into sovereign debt. So enter neoliberalism 1.0. And neoliberalism as an economic theory had infiltrated the economic departments of many of the world's largest universities. And economists who were trained in that model moved out and they began to take positions in the World Bank, the IMF, or in finance departments of different governments. So I'm not saying that these are evil people. These are people who were brought up with a certain theory, right? And it's a theoretical economic model, and they believed in it, and they thought it would actually work. So along came this debt crisis, so to help prevent the nascent global economy from imploding, they came up with structural adjustment. I suspect many of you have probably had to read about or study what some of the implications of structural adjustment have been in terms of health, education, cutbacks, privatizations, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the kind of the rollback model. I'd already told you the story about Zambia and about donating clothes, so we'll just pass over that. And sort of say that even as neoliberalism 1.0, this kind of rolling out this neoliberal economic model around the world, we had this rollout, not the rollback, but the rollout, and that's the financialization of the economy. And that's when the investors, people with capital, the nascent 1%, discovered that it was much easier to make money from money than lending to the real economy. So instead of putting money into investing in production and consumption, so workers who produce things for consumers who have jobs to buy things, who then sort of by buying things create more work for people who produce things, that's the old classical economy, they found it was much easier to basically place bets. So you had all of the speculative investment, this funny money, this shadow banking system, and that was really enabled by the repeal of bank regulations and the deregulation of hedging and all of the new digital technologies. 60% of all the trades that occur on stock markets are made by artificial intelligence algorithms. They're not made by traders. They're not made by people. They're made by computers. So this is the kind of the world that we've been moving into in terms of financialization. To give an idea of this growth, just since 1998, lower left-hand side. So these are derivatives. These are the kind of funny money instruments that are created through financialization. So money made from money, also made from rent-seeking. You can sort of see the scale at which this just escalated leading up to 2008 and the financial crisis. So the value of all of this funny money and derivatives 10 times more than the total value of the world's global economy. That just doesn't make sense. That's totally irrational. That doesn't follow even any of the conventional economic rules, and it doesn't. But it's there because it has yet to be regulated or brought down. So it dipped a little bit after the financial crisis, but then, yay, game over. We'll go back to the same funny money speculation. Now, when we had the financial crisis of 2008, the market collapse, How many of you remember quite vividly that period of time? You know, yeah, shops going out of order, stuff like this. It's just, oh, what are we going to do? All of a sudden, you know, if your parents were looking around and saying, you know, all of my retirement savings have just lost 40%. What am I going to do? I'm going to have to keep working until I'm 96. So we had the 2008, for a very brief period of time, governments around the world, at least high-income governments around the world, not the low and middle income because they didn't have the availability or the capital to do so, but they had a brief rediscovery of Keynesian economics and investing in the real economy. So we had all of this stimulus money that was put in, the shovel-ready money. We need to get that old economy working again. So governments went into enormous amounts of debt to be able to, you know, borrowing from the very sources that caused all of these economic crises in the first place, to try to get that old economy jump-started. And to some extent, it worked. The other thing they did is, especially in the United States, is they did this thing called quantitative easing, which is where the Federal Reserve basically just invented money out of thin air, trillions of it, and lent it to banks to sort of recapitalize the banks, so that on the premise that the banks would then lend that money back into the commercial sector or into the private credit to consumers, into the consumer market. But they didn't. They went right back into the funny money speculative system. So all of this quantitative easing, all it did was create more and more of this derivative financial debt burden. Meanwhile, governments were kind of having to now pay back with interest money that they'd borrowed to bail out the very banks. So they had to pay back to the banks with interest money they'd given to the banks to bail them out. As a result, within about 2 years, we had neoliberalism 3.0, austerity. So to reduce the public debts mostly incurred by bailing out the private banks. And the agenda under the austerity program is really little different from the discredited structural adjustment programs of neoliberalism 1.0. The difference here being, well, we don't have to force open markets anymore through liberalization. We've already managed to do that. But now it no longer is just low and middle income countries. It's almost every country in the world. Would you say the Netherlands is still experiencing its own austerity? No, Canada has. Politicians like to sort of say that we've turned the corner around this particular period, you know, around we no longer kind of have real austerity. But what reveals the kind of the spin on that is that governments worldwide are spending substantially less in terms of public spending, regardless of what they're spending it on, but less in public spending now as a percentage of their GDP than they did prior to 2008. So one of the outcomes of 2008 is governments have receded in terms of what they're actually being able to spend or how they're actually to engage in the economy. Unless we think that we're out of the woods around potential future financial crisis, this is the former UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown kind of was talking about, we're sleepwalking into a future crisis. So we've just exploded cheap money. We have loans being pushed like crazy once again on low-income countries, risky mortgages all over the place with shadow banking happening, global debt levels higher than they were prior to the 2008 financial crisis. These real estate bubbles worldwide, and it may very well be that China becomes the trigger for the next global financial crisis. And we no longer have available the same policy options that we had in 2008, which was stimulus spending and quantitative easing. We no longer have those because our rates are so low at this point in time. It worked when the rates were high, and you could use quantitative easing to bring them down, but not any longer. So, that's the first half. Well, second half's a bit shorter, but I'll get through it. But how many of you kind of at this point do feel a little bit like overwhelmed and why did I even bother coming here? This is not how I wanted to spend a nice, pleasant Tuesday afternoon. So, what I'll do is I'll sort of proceed to talk about how we can turn this around. What are the policies that we know will work to turn this around? If we presume that we are going to be living in some form of a capitalist economy for some time to come, Paul Mason yesterday gave a lecture talking about post-capitalism and that we're in a transition period to post-capitalism. Well, yes, I think if nothing more we have to be, but it's going to be a while before we get there, so we're going to have differing models. But within a capitalist system, there's only two ways in which we've ever been able to look at reducing inequalities. And the first is to reduce or to increase the share of economic product, economic activity that goes to labor rather than goes to capital. Capital being, again, that wonderful 1%. Or we reduce post-market income inequalities through taxes and various forms of social spending. Only two systems we've ever come up with since the dawn of capitalism to try to deal with growing inequalities. So apologies for the fact that my examples that I'm going to give are from two kind of white American males of a certain generation, but I think they capture it very well. So with respect to reducing the inequalities by giving more to labor than to capital, Henry Ford. I have to pay my workers enough to buy the cars they make for me. Right? So simple way of thinking is that if workers don't have money, they're not going to be able to buy the stuff that workers make. So we need to look at ensuring that labor has a fair share of whatever that production and consumption economy creates, putting aside how much production and consumption we can ecologically manage, but goes to labor. And at that point, we're actually not doing terribly well. So some data that in terms of the share of world labor income in world gross output. So between 1980 and 2010, I haven't updated this material at all, but you see that in 1980, about 63% of all the income or wealth that was created by our economy went to people, to workers, people who are employed in some way as labor. And then it dropped. It's now at 54%, is probably lower than that. So we have then instead now, at least within the SDG suite of goals, we have goal 8, to achieve full and productive employment, decent work for all, protect labor rights, et cetera, especially for those in precarious employment. There are some who would sort of say, well, we really can't do that because we have too many people chasing too few jobs for too little pay in order to be able to consume too much stuff with too much debt to be able to undertake that. So there are arguments that the full labor ideal is probably impractical. But even on that basis, one of the other targets, or amongst the other targets of the goal 8, achieve higher levels of economic productivity. Now, the problem with higher levels of economic productivity, what does it mean to have higher levels of economic productivity? Anybody with a bit of an economics background want to take a stab at that?
That you produce more for the same amount of hours? Or the same
Yep.
amount of workers?
Yep. You're producing more with less labor. So you increase productivity. You don't need as many workers to produce, like Henry Ford doesn't need that many workers to produce the cars as it became more and more mechanized, right? So now we get into robotics, we get into issues of artificial intelligence, we get into being able to create all kinds of economic productivity without increasing labor. In fact, with diminishing labor. So there's a built-in contradiction in this sustainable development goal. How do you create more employment when your target is really to increase productivity, which means doing more with less labor? So there are policies to start to overcome, or at least to ameliorate, some of those contradictions. One of them is to strengthen labor rights, and that includes looking at central bargaining. And in fact, some of that is going on in some parts of the world, so we're seeing a return now to stronger collective bargaining or labor power. We're seeing more strikes happening, and this is even in some of the low-income countries. So labor is reasserting its voice. increases in minimum wages, which of course is always opposed by the private sector, by the business community, but there's been no evidence, longitudinal or empirical evidence to suggest that when you increase the minimum wages, that companies earn less money, right? They don't, because if people have more money in their pocket, they're more likely to buy more stuff. The more important one that's being debated, and this goes to the fact that we have too many people trying to, pursuing jobs, too many workers pursuing kind of employment with too little pay, too little opportunity, too much insecurity. So it's this notion of a universal basic income that on the basis of basically being a citizen somewhere, you have an entitlement to have enough income. This is welfare transfers, it could be cash benefit, there are different ways in which a universal basic income, but you have a fixed amount of income. Then there's also looking at labor rights in trade and investment agreements, so trying to look at more protection for workers and workers' wages within trade agreements. That's an entirely different topic. I do a lot of research on that, so I won't go too far down that path. Suffice to say that most of it now, at the present time, is just nice window dressing without really real substance. But there's a problem with the universal basic income. So I want to get to the next big issue about reducing income or wealth inequalities and reducing this post-market inequalities through taxation, transfers, and universally accessible public services or subsidized essential goods. And the reason is simple. If we live in a market society, and if all I do is I give you more cash, right? I'm going to give you more money now as part of universal basic income. What's to, without regulation, without subsidies, what's to prevent the grocer from raising prices, your landlord from raising the rent, unsubsidized public transportation from putting up the costs? In other words, markets have an incredible ability to take whatever the maximum amount of cash is out of people's pockets. The only thing that prevents that from happening is when people have access to things that they don't have to pay for. So that's where you get into subsidized housing, you get into universally accessible public services of some form or another. And one of the ways, of course, the only way we can achieve this is through taxation. And this is my other kind of American of a certain kind of demographic period, Oliver Wendell Holmes, the jurist, Supreme Court Justice in the States, that taxes are the price we pay for a civilized world. So if you think of nothing more in terms of at least the income or wealth inequality aspect of globalization than these two sayings, right? I have to pay my workers enough to buy the cars they make for me, or taxes are the price we pay for a civilized world, you will have captured the essence of what has to happen in terms of beginning to transform our current economy. Unfortunately, much like what's happened in labor markets, we've seen this rapid, steady decline in the high-end marginal tax rate in wealthy countries. So that's the rate at which people over 300,000 or over 500,000, over $1 million have to pay. That's the percentage they have to pay on their taxes. And it used to be in the 1960s and up through the 1970s that the marginal rate in many high-income countries was 70 or 80%. That's the amount of tax that was collected on incomes of people who are now the kind of like tax avoiding billionaire class, the 1%. So we used to be able to tax at very, very high rates. But then we've seen this steady, steady decline in terms of what the top end marginal rate would be. We've also seen the same decline in corporate taxes. So this is the official tax rate on average worldwide has dropped from just under 55% to just over 40%. But in fact, if you look at with all the deductions and little loopholes that corporations make use of, it's actually only 23%. In fact, the last aggregate figure I saw was 22%. So that's the average corporate tax rate now that's being paid around the world. And in some places, like the US, some studies, this goes back into 2010, that the real tax rate is between 12 and 15%. And under the Trump administration, who wants to kind of put in a flat tax now is going to put it in at about 20%, 20 or 21%. So is this solution partly simply a matter of taxation? And I would say it is. I mean, we need to really have a progressive taxation revolt. An American study that if we raise the marginal rate from 35 to 68%, which is lower than they used to be in the 1970s, reduce poverty, inequality, stimulate economic growth. IMF says, a little bit more conservatively, well, it's okay. We can easily afford a marginal rate at 60%. And an optimality that tried to look at beyond just the economy itself, basically said you could put a 90% marginal tax rate on incomes over $300,000. Yes, we'd have a little bit of decline in GDP per capita, kind of the wealth, but greater overall well-being and happiness. In simple terms, we could afford massive increases in individual income tax and as well in corporate tax. And the world wouldn't fall apart, right? If anything, the world would stick together a little bit. I looked at this more at a global scale. And I looked at what the value of the economic product was in 2002, the only year I could get, the earliest year I could get data for, and tracked it through to 2016 and monetized that by looking at what changes had taken place in the average global taxation rate. And what you wind up with is that in 2002, almost $28 trillion in untaxed income was floating around. I'm not suggesting that we tax every bit of income. I don't know about you, but I like to have a little bit of autonomous change and currency that I can use besides just my credit card. But by 2016, right, 14 years later, $65 trillion in untaxed income, right? Do we need to have so much untaxed income floating around? Because we know, remember that hockey stick going up? Who's sitting with that untaxed income, right? It's not doing anybody any good. It's not helping to solve the ecological problems. It's not helping to solve the migration problem. It's not helping to solve the economic problem. Oxfam, again, in its own inimitable fashion, said if we were able to put just a 1.5% tax on billionaires and translating that into funding of health or education programs, that we'd save 23 million lives. And this partly happens through something called the magic of estimated fiscal multipliers, where fiscal multipliers mean that what is spent in public money actually helps economies to grow. But here, the best fiscal multiplying money that governments can spend on is environment, education, culture and recreation, and health. For those of you who are involved in any way in health promotion, you'll realize that these are many of the sectors that we think are most important in terms of producing people's health or well-being. So when governments spend money in that, for every dollar that they spend on average, they're stimulating between $1.30 and $1.70 in more economic output or GDP per capita. So public spending actually helps the economy. So what else do we want to do? Well, it's very difficult to increase progressive taxation within countries unless you start to close down the borders around capital flight. This isn't a question of erecting borders to close down on the vagabonds, but certainly on capital, footloose capital. In 2018, the OECD, 22,000 people in 21 high-income countries, what was their #1 policy choice? Tax the rich and spend more on social protection. So the vast majority of people would actually support higher rates of taxation if it goes into social spending, into collectivity, creating more social solidarity. Now that's important to know because ultimately, if you're concerned about globalization, any action you take on globalization is going to start within the nation state. It's going to start within local communities. Also, avoiding to end the tax avoidance, and that's something called the policies to eliminate base erosion and profit shifting. That's where where companies can move their capital around to avoid paying tax by moving it through tax haven countries in one fashion or another. One of the problems we face with that in low-income countries is that most low-income countries, even in Africa, which has done quite a bit to try to increase its percentage of taxation rates in recent years, although it has such a low economic productivity to begin with, or low economic output, it still doesn't translate into what they need to develop their health, education, or infrastructure programs. But their royalties, the extraction, the main source of capital flight exiting the continent of Africa, many of these countries don't tax it at all. And so that's a legacy, partly of structural adjustment. You could look at perhaps cronyism or a little bit of corruption feeding into that as well. But they're not collecting on what, in fact, is their natural endowments. So there's a great deal of work that could be done there within the continent. Significantly increase developing country tax authority. One of the things that we've heard from a lot of the African leaders now in different kind of public forums, global governance forums, is they want advice on how to improve their taxation measures. So, yes, we'll accept your development assistance, but we need to create more autonomy within our own borders. But to do that, we need to create more accountable tax systems. So please help us there. But if we have a global system, right, if we have all this global financing moving back and forth, what about the idea of a financial transaction tax? Has anyone not heard of a financial transaction tax, or what that is? That's been a very popular movement around that about 20, 25 years ago. It was initially recommended by some economists on the basis of saying if you have footloose capital moving from one country to another country, it becomes hot money. It flows into the country, it invests in the stock market or in various sorts of things. That drives up the value of the currency in that country relative to other currencies because speculators move in, and then the early speculators immediately cash out and they make a windfall, but then the whole currency collapses and the country's economy collapses, and that's happened in Southeast Asia, it happened in Brazil, it's happened in Russia. And you could sort of say to some extent the 2008 financial crisis was it happening at a global scale. So the argument here is that you put a small tax on currency exchanges as a way of dampening that kind of speculative flows. So a tax of 5 cents on every $100 is about twice as much, almost twice as much of all the estimated financing that's required to achieve all 17 SDGs and all 169 targets. And meanwhile, governments, instead of imposing these taxes, they're busy sitting around trying to figure out how can we get poor countries to sort of become self-financing to achieve their own SDGs. Well, they're not going to be able to do that. We have so much an abundance of so much income or wealth. But what we have is a real lack of our ability to sort of transfer that around. Financial transaction tax would be a very, very simple way to do that. And we have nascent funding mechanisms at the global scale with good governance that would be able to do that for health systems, for education systems, green funds for environment, or meeting some of the sustainable development goals. So there are mechanisms in place to allocate equitably the distribution of the taxation that would be gathered through this system. It's there. It's a policy. It can work. But it needs to be argued. It needs to be fought for. Closed tax havens. I won't say too much more about that. I think moving on, we know that we have to do that. There's so much of that money that's parked there. It's unconscionable. But now, that image that is so striking in terms of our frail, fragile planet, this wonderful little kind of blue ball in the sky. So the choices that we make will create quite different outcomes. So this is from the IPCC. And what it basically says, if we are to engage right now environmentally with substantial mitigation, we will see increases in temperature, but we will survive. But if we don't do substantial mitigation, we're going to basically turn the planet into a firestorm. Right? That's pretty much certain. The modeling over and over again gets done, and it comes up with the same outcome. And if anything, its new modeling is telling us we have a shorter period of time with even worse outcomes. Now, how do we deal with that? So we have a lot of different mitigations, like much more efficient use of energy, low carbon to a zero carbon future. And the prediction basically is that we don't hit a zero carbon future by about 2030 or by about 2040, we kind of may as well just sort of say, well, it's been nice knowing you. Carbon sinks, deforestation, reduce the deforestation, improve forest management. One of the greatest problems we face right now in terms of deforestation is palm oil. Are you familiar with the controversies around palm oil? Yeah, deforesting huge chunks of Southeast Asia. An individual change. But there are some tipping points. Right? So there are some reasons to be cautiously optimistic, because after all, we need to be optimistic. It doesn't help to be pessimistic. So fossil fuel divestment is increasing rapidly. So people who are pulling out of capitalizing fossil fuels, the fossil fuel industry. Interesting, maybe somewhat ironic, that the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which of course became massively wealthy, it's the largest wealth fund anywhere on the planet, it did so on the backs of oil and natural gas extraction. But now it sort of said, we're getting out of the business. We're going to get rid of any investments in oil and natural gas. We have this massive growth in solar. And much of it is actually being driven by innovations in China, to such an extent that countries that have lagged behind on this, such as the United States to some extent, they will try to use trade treaty rules to sort of charge the WTO with dumping, because it's subsidizing its solar energy development, and then that solar energy is being exported into the United States. But dietary shifts away from meat. This is a big one, and that will safely predict that probably within about 10 years, if not sooner, we're going to start to see the same taxation measures have been applied to tobacco or to alcohol or other unhealthy commodities are going to be applied to meat. There's going to be kind of Pigovian tax measures to sort of try to move us away from a heavily meat-based diet to a much larger vegetarian diet. But then also the move to end food waste. 30 to 50% of everything we produce as food. Now, here we have a planet with too many people and too little agricultural production. But so much of this is going into waste. Now, at least on paper, the world's countries are getting better by this huge incremental increase in the number of environmental treaties that they're busily signing. And some of which, like if you recall the Ozone Treaty, has teeth. But we confront this very fundamental contradiction. And this is a report that came out of the UK around the same time that the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health that I was involved with as chairing and leading the Globalization Knowledge Network, we released our report. No credible, socially just, ecologically sustainable scenario to grow incomes continuously for a world of soon to be 9 billion people, right? Can't work. We ain't going to be able to do it. That economic model, the one that has created such inequalities, such ecological depredation, leading towards all of this forced migration that we're witnessing, simply is not going to work. So when they tried to model this in traditional econometric fashion, they came up with 3 headline solutions to sort of try to deal with the ecological economic imbalance. And so, surprisingly, unsurprisingly, they're the same as what I've been talking about throughout this particular lecture. Progressive tax reforms. Redistribution of work. Some of us work way too much. Some of us don't work at all. Some of us work in various precarious situations. And a clear break into the non-fossil fuel economy. So this is what they modeled. I said, it can be done. right? We can get there. And another way of looking at that is Kate Raworth's work. Is anybody here familiar with donut economics? Yeah. If you're not, this is a book that's very worthwhile to try to spend some time reading, because she takes that ecological stuff that I showed earlier in terms of the natural boundaries that we're transgressing, and then she looks at the social stuff, our own social relations, which brings it back into our interpersonal, our social, our political, our collectivity, and sort of says, here's the things that need to change at the collectivity level. Here's the things that we have to pay attention to at the ecological level. And so all of our financial decisions, all of our policy decisions, all of our economic decisions need to address how they are reducing the ecological and increasing the collectivity. That's our basic argument. So we need to do economic modeling that's based upon sort of a different set of outputs at the ecological scale and at the social scale. And there is, again, a little bit of optimism that might exist in terms of the fact that yes, we might be able to make a difference. Now, most of the predictions are saying is that we've got about 15 years at the most to use it or lose it. But the argument here is that although we'd have to spend about $90 trillion around the climate change issue, the climate action, that this would still yield an annual gain of about $26 trillion through to 2030 compared to business as usual. So it's not going to be quite as expensive as we thought. And the way we're going to get there is perhaps fairly unsurprising. We need to price carbon. Now, this is a little bit compelling for me coming from Canada. We have a flurry of right-wing conservative governments taking over at the provincial level. And we have a federal government that's imposed a carbon tax. And we have all of these provincial governments that are refusing to abide by the carbon tax and attacking it like crazy. And meanwhile, we had a report that basically said Canada, of all the nations in the world, Canada since the 1940s has experienced the greatest increase in annual average temperatures, and especially up north, but across all of the continent. So this was a shock to me. I thought that Canada would be a good place to sort of experience climate change. We've got lots of fresh water. You know, we're used to cold winters. Who cares? We dress well. But to sort of find out that Canada, so the same day that we get this report, and this report came out of Environment Canada. It came out of the federal government, pointing out how we've had this massive increase in temperature change, worse than anybody else, any place else on the world, with all kinds of knock-on negative externalities around our water supply, our agriculture, our cities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, we had all these provincial governments, right-wing governments, sort of saying no to a carbon tax. It would just take away jobs. It would destroy our economy. It's just a tax grab by these lefties. Okay, huge investment, sustainable infrastructure, strong regulations, carbon sequestration, water restoration, eliminate economic waste, but the really big one, decreasing unsustainable consumption. That's the fundamental break that we have to make now. And I would suggest that we're not going to be able to break the economy as a whole from that consumption treadmill easily or in the near term. But one of the things that we can all face as individuals is we can start to break our own consumption treadmills. So if I show up next year wearing the same outfit with the same tie and the same pants, and they've got a bit of holes with a little bit of patching on them, you'll know that I'm trying to break my own consumption treadmill. Migration solutions, our third existential crisis. There has to be some form of financial transfer, especially in the case of migration to high-income countries or destination countries from poorer south countries, source countries. Development assistance alone is not enough. One option that I developed when we were doing the research on health worker migration from African countries to Canada was that you could take a portion of the income that they earned for a period of time within Canada and paid tax on, and the government in Canada itself could remit a portion of that tax directly back to the country that they left, with the proviso that it go directly into the health system or the education system or whatever system it was these skilled workers came from, disproportionately more than what they lost as a consequence of that migration. So that's a way of a bilateral tax arrangement where a high-income country that benefits is actually giving back to the low-income country that is losing. And again here, this idea of a global skills partnership, where high-income countries would pay at least twice as much as the cost of producing a skilled worker that they think might migrate to their country that they would like, so that the country actually is creating more of that skilled workforce cadre than it loses to the high-income country. There are a lot of problems with that, but at least it's being mooted as a potential solution. And what we also have now is the Global Compact for Migration. Has the Netherlands signed on to the Global Compact? Yeah, it has. Canada has as well. The United States, of course, is not. Well, at least it's consistent. This claims to sort of try to overcome this emerging global governance regime for migration, but it's littered. The claim here is it's littered by all these conventions and declarations which have mostly failed to impact on real policies and politics. So we've got a bit of the ways to go around that. In relationship to the SDGs, there's no sustainable development goal that is specific to migration. But the International Order of Migration has basically looked at that and sort of said, well, kind of a whole heap of these SDGs have an indirect bearing on migration, both in terms of a just or equitable flow or managed flow of people that is mutually beneficial to source and destination country, and also respectful of individuals themselves. Now, that brings me then to the question of the SDGs. So if you didn't know all 17 of them, here they are, with their 169 targets. Now, they're full of contradictions. Okay, so they're not a perfect set. But at their headline level, what they do actually is tell us what most of the world's people, many of the world's people, because of the world we want exercise that led in parallel to the kind of creation of the SDGs, and what most of the world's governments signed on to. So it's a kind of an aspirational set of statements about if the world was going to work properly, this is what it would look like. These are the things that we would be aiming to do. Not production and consumption, not endless economic growth, but we would aim to sort of create some of these positive outputs. Now, no one expects all of these to be achieved. And if anything, at the present time, we seem to be going backwards on trying to achieve them. But we should allow ourselves to be inspired by the vision that they create and work to basically confront our governments about how well or how not well they're doing in trying to meet these. So the goals that they think are most likely to be met. So this was a study that the Rockefeller Foundation undertook, and it basically looked at people who are working in the field of the SDGs. So I thought, oh, achieving zero hunger, most optimistic. 20% thought that we would achieve that. Eliminate extreme poverty, clean energy, good health and well-being, the partnership idea, decent work, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, but you can sort of see that the majority of people who responded were not optimistic about achieving any of the goals. So these are the ones that they thought we might have a better chance of achieving by 2030. And we have, as I say, this kind of oxymoron within the Sustainable Development Goal. So we basically quantify and model these inconsistencies. So this came out of a recent journal article. And they conclude that the SDG agenda will fail as a whole if we continue with the business as usual. So another repetition of the problem with the business as usual ain't going to get us there. And what they looked at is that the major problem here is the focus on economic growth and consumption is going to prevent us from achieving that. If we look at health, education, or some of the other social goals, or certainly the environmental protection goals, those we can do. But if we focus on the economic growth and consumption goals, we're going to be shooting ourselves in the foot. So it really names the fundamental kind of contradiction that underlies the SDGs. So if we're going to move forward, it's pretty hard to create a lobby force for 17 goals and 169 targets. That's a mouthful, right? Ask me to name all 17 goals. I can't remember what all 17 goals are, and I'm in the business. So some years ago, just after they were released, I tried to say, how can we come up with a shorter list? And why is a shorter list important? So the first is ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Now, the reason why I think that that is a fundamental goal is because unless people are literate, unless people have a kind of social language, they will not have, in a sense, the capacity to be able to hold their own governments to account. So the more educated a populace we have, meaningfully educated populace, the more likely we're going to have an engaged and active citizenry that's going to be pushing their governments in the direction that they need to go in. The other is to reduce inequality within and among countries, bearing in mind that that has to have a redistributive mechanism, not just grow the bottom 40% a bit faster than we grow everybody else. And the reason why I emphasize that rather than the reducing inequality goal, or not the reducing, the reduced poverty goal, and don't talk about that, because everybody likes to talk about the poverty goal. It's because you cannot reduce inequality without eliminating poverty, right? So an inequality goal actually assumes that you've already achieved the poverty goal. But you can achieve the poverty goal without reducing inequality. So which is the more important goal? The inequality goal. And the last one, ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. Now, I'd have to change that around and sort of say, to slightly rephrase that, you need to ensure that consumption and production patterns are ecologically sustainable. Right? It's not that we want to continue to have more and more consumption and production. We need to have consumption and production that is ecologically sustainable. And very recently, we could look at a fourth goal. And this came up from a study that identified as the three most important goals: the reducing inequality, the consumption and production patterns. Rather than the education, they said the third goal that is most important is the action to combat climate change and its impacts. So to bring this to a close, I'll talk about another book rather than the one I just finished writing, but one I've contributed to frequently. Is the Global Health Watch. And this is a product of kind of activist academics and activist NGO people and grassroots workers internationally. It's the 5th edition now, so it's been around for a while. It's kind of the alternative World Health Report. The 5th edition and all previous 4 editions are available free at that website. You download them, they're free. It's a compendium of a lot of really good information. And it always ends by talking about activist civil society. I think that if you're thinking about what can you do right now, I would sort of say that if you want to take some action or be concerned about these globalization dimensions, think of those 3 existential crises, right? The equity crisis, the inequity crisis, the ecological crisis, and the migration crisis. And which of those do you feel most powerfully drawn to as an activist, as someone who needs to feel a need to do something about it? Then find a civil society group that you think is trying to attack that problem, to deal with that problem, to advocate around that problem in the most concerted, consistent, and analytically rigorous way. And then see what you can do to support that group in doing so. And it could be at a local level, it could be at a national level, it could be at a global scale. People's Health Movement being one of the global kind of health organizations. So there are things that you can do in the moment. So one of the ways in which we can sort of combat ourselves in terms of feeling overwhelmed is to realize, of course, that we're not alone. And there are activist movements around the world. Hopefully some of you in some of your international work will have come across some of these activist movements, these civil society groups or actors in low and middle income countries. The other is to realize that what we call globalization, all of these processes I've talked about, they place restraints on governments, but they don't eliminate governments. Governments created these constraints. Governments can reform and undo some of these constraints. So a focus for a great deal of our work is still at the national government level, because they're the ones that are going to either undo, redo, or make worse the kind of rules or structures at a global scale that then trickle down through national governments to subnational governments to local governments and get in the way of people being healthy in the day-to-day experience of their lives. Political activism and social mobilization. And there is evidence of a growth in progressive politics in most parts of the world. We have a kind of a regressive, illiberal kind of politics at the elected scale, but at the citizen scale, at the civil society scale, there's more activism now than ever before. And social media, of course, that may be creating a new global politics. So it's become extremely important in terms of how people mobilize. But the lessons from the past, to the extent that they may still be relevant in the present, is that you cannot sustain that kind of momentary, that brief moment of something like an Occupy movement without having an organizational base that continues to sort of keep that pressure going. So I want to leave you with just a few useful aphorisms. I actually closed the book this way because I always think it's useful to sort of think about what is it that we can draw some inspiration from to sort of move forward. So this is Antonio Gramsci from the Prison Notebook. So he was an anarchist who was put in jail, a socialist or communist anarchist, in jail in the early 1900s. And he talked about being a pessimist because of intelligence, an optimist of the will. So it's, So better to be an optimist of the will than to be a pessimist of the intellect. Another one that I like, it comes a little bit more recently from the United States, from the 1960s. This backyards radical organizer, community organizer in the United States from Chicago. Rules for Radicals is probably his most famous book, Saul Alinsky. And he said, so at times we do fall back and become discouraged. The pursuit of happiness is never ending. Happiness lies in the pursuit. So that notion that we don't necessarily do all of these things because we expect to achieve these goals. We would like to, but the forces that we might be contending with are so overwhelming that if we go at it thinking that we're going to win, no. We go at it because we need to go at it. And in the pursuit of that, we actually sort of achieve our own sense of contentment or containment by doing those things. Another way in which I kind of thought about that is there's a Sufi parable that talks about a definition of generosity. And the definition of generosity is doing justice without requiring justice. So you engage in these things because you know you need to engage in them, and the very act of engagement is sufficient to bring its own sense of, I guess, existential reward. And then finally, the Emma Goldman, who was an anarcho-feminist, again, from the early 1900s. And this, I love this. A revolution without dancing is not a revolution worth having. So another way in which that got paraphrased is that if I can't dance, it's not my revolution. Now, I take that to some heart because once upon a time, and I still am, but I was a drummer. And I was a rock and roll drummer, which is why I'm deaf now and I wear hearing aids. And also, once upon a time, I had dark hair, as you can sort of see, and was skinnier, but the beard's always been the same. We, in terms of the political actions we used to take, we would have demonstrations, we'd have policy marches, we'd do policy briefs, we'd meet with politicians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We'd supply the sound system for the demos that might take place on the streets, but we always organized a dance afterwards. So there's this, I'm very kind of partial to Emma Goldman about that if I can't dance, it's not my revolution. And what that basically means is that when you pursue activism to tackle something as huge as globalization, something as huge as this rampaging inequalities, this ecological crisis that we're facing, the migration pressures that are happening as a consequence, as you do that, you really need to take care of yourself, and you need to take care of one another, and, dare I say it, you need to have some fun. That this stuff should be something done in a way that brings you pleasure, that brings you some enjoyment. So, there you have it, and there's the outline of the book again, and you're happy to walk away with a leaflet, unfortunately not with a copy of the book itself.